April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday off Okinawa. A Japanese Zero slams into HMS Indefatigable at 300 miles per hour, carrying 550 pounds of high explosive. American officers brace for catastrophe. They've seen what happens when kamikazes hit their carriers, hundreds dead, months in repair yards. 37 minutes later, British aircraft are landing again. What made British carriers different? Hit subscribe. We revealed the engineering that changed naval warfare. Let me paint you the picture of what American naval officers expected to see that Easter morning. They'd watched USS Franklin get hit by conventional bombs just 2 weeks earlier, March 19, 1945. The bombs penetrated the wooden flight deck into the hangar, where 31 armed and fueled aircraft sat waiting. The subsequent explosions and fires killed 807 sailors. Franklin never operated aircraft again. They knew USS Bunker Hill would lose 396 sailors to 2 kamikazes next month, May 11th. The ship would still be under repair when the war ended in August. When a kamikaze struck an American carrier, it meant catastrophe. It meant 6 months in a repair yard at Pearl Harbor. Sometimes it meant the ship would never fight again. The kamikaze tactic was working. The Divine Wind kamikaze in Japanese was bleeding the American fleet white. Japanese pilots had perfected their tactics attacking American carriers. They knew where to aim. They understood what happened when bombs penetrated wooden flight decks and exploded among parked aircraft full of fuel and ammunition. They'd sunk 3 American escort carriers outright. They'd crippled 2 fleet carriers so badly they never fought again. American blood proved the tactic worked. Then the British Pacific Fleet arrived with 4 armored carriers, HMS Formidable, Victorious, Indefatigable, and Indomitable Land. Everything the Japanese thought they knew about attacking carriers turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Ever built something only to discover it was the wrong solution? The roots of British carrier superiority began not in the Pacific, but in the Mediterranean. Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson commanded HMS Furious and served as Rear Admiral aircraft carriers before becoming Third Sea Lord in 1935. Henderson understood something his American counterparts did yet grasp. British carriers would fight in narrow seas. The Mediterranean, the North Sea, the English Channel. These were waters within easy range of enemy land-based bombers. British carriers couldn't run. They couldn't hide in the vast Pacific. They would be found. They would be attacked. And they needed to survive. The Abyssinian crisis of 1935 crystallized Henderson's thinking. British carriers exercised in the Mediterranean under threat from Italian air power. The vulnerability was terrifying. In an era before radar, when Royal Air Force doctrine held that the bomber will always get through, Henderson concluded that fighters couldn't intercept every attack. Carriers needed passive protection. They needed armor. Henderson drove through a revolutionary design that the Admiralty initially considered impossible. Build an aircraft carrier where the flight deck itself is armored. 3 inches of hardened steel protecting the entire flight deck. Make that armor plate serve as the ship's strength deck, the primary structural element carrying the whole bending loads. Surround the hangar with 4.5 inches of armored bulkheads. Create an armored citadel that could survive 500-pound bombs dropped from 7,000 feet. Naval architect W.WWII Forbes solved the engineering puzzle. Several alternative designs had to be worked out before I could get a fully armored carrier of 23,000 tons. And one of the main secrets was that the 3-inch armor plate, which formed the flight deck, was used both for protection and longitudinal strength. It was brilliant. It was unprecedented, and it worked. HMS Illustrious was laid down at Vickers Armstrong Barrow on April 27, 1937. The design process that normally took 3 years was compressed to 3 months. Admiral Henderson died in March 1939 from overwork-related illness just 2 months after resigning due to ill health. He never saw his revolutionary carriers prove themselves in combat. But his legacy would save thousands of British lives. By 1945, those 4 armored carriers joined the Pacific War, and the Japanese were about to learn a brutal lesson. By 1945, the British Pacific Fleet operated as Task Force 57 under American command. Their mission: neutralize Japanese airfields in the Sakishima Islands during the invasion of Okinawa. Suppress enemy aircraft before they could reach American forces. Nobody told the Japanese pilots these British carriers were different. Nobody explained that 3-inch armored flight decks couldn't be penetrated like American wooden decks. The Kamikazes attacked British carriers the same way they attacked American carriers. And they discovered the hard way that everything had changed. Easter Sunday, 1945, 07 to 8 hours. The first Kamikaze hit. 2 Seafire pilots scored cannon hits on the Zero as it approached HMS Indefatigable. The aircraft began breaking apart mid-air but continued its attack. It looped over the carrier and dove toward the flight deck, hitting on the starboard side near the island structure. Captain Quentin Dick Graham watched the impact. The explosion was massive. The flight deck was depressed 3 inches over a 15-foot area. The pilot's briefing room was demolished. The sickbay was destroyed. Lieutenant Commander Pat Chambers, the flying officer, was killed instantly. Lieutenant Leonard T., the air engineer officer, died at his post. Dr. Alan Vaughan, a Canadian surgeon lieutenant, died trying to save wounded sailors. 14 men dead. But the armored deck held. The bomb detonated on impact against 3 inches of hardened steel instead of penetrating through. To the hangar, where 36 aircraft waited, fully fueled and armed. There was no massive secondary explosion, no chain reaction of bombs and torpedoes cooking off, no aviation fuel fires spreading through multiple decks. The damage was terrible but contained. Lieutenant Commander Sandy Sanderson, the flight deck engineer, jury-rigged a replacement crash barrier. Chief Petty Officer Jimmy Green controlled a small hangar fire. Damage control teams swept wreckage overboard and filled the crater with quick-setting concrete. At 0816 for 8 minutes after impact, the first Seafire landed safely. HMS Indefatigable continued combat operations throughout the day. American observers could not believe what they were seeing. An American officer aboard ship watched damage control teams work with ruthless efficiency. He turned to his British counterpart and said something that would become legendary in naval history. When a Kamikaze hits a United States carrier, it's 6 months repair at Pearl Harbor. When a Kamikaze hits a Limey carrier, it's just a case of sweepers. Man your brooms. What would you do if your enemy's weapons suddenly stopped working? The disparity was almost incomprehensible. USS Franklin had been hit by conventional bombs, not even kamikazes, on March 19th. The bombs penetrated the wooden flight deck into the hangar. The ship lost 807 sailors. Franklin never operated aircraft again. 6 months later, the carrier was still under repair. HMS Indefatigable lost 14 men and was operational in under an hour. The Japanese didn't understand what was happening. Their tactics perfected against American carriers were failing against the British, but they kept trying. And what happened next would prove just how revolutionary British armor really was. This story gets more incredible. Hit that like button. May 4th, 1945. 11:31 hours. The Kamikazes returned in force. A Zero emerged from clouds and struck HMS Formidable with a glancing blow 9 feet starboard of centerline, adjacent to the island. Captain Philip Rockeen watched the Kamikaze hit at the junction of 3 14-ton armored plates. The bomb fragmented, penetrated through the hangar deck and into an oil tank below. The center boiler room flooded with steam and had to be evacuated. The flight deck showed a 2-foot square hole and a 24 by 20-foot depression up to 2 feet deep. But the armor had not been fully penetrated. 11 aircraft on the deck park were destroyed. 8 men were killed and 47 wounded. Speed dropped to 18 knots as damage control parties fought fires. By 1700 hours, 5.5 hours after impact, the flight deck was operational again. Damage control teams had filled the hole with rapid set, concrete, timber infill, and tack-welded steel plates. Formidable continued launching and recovering aircraft. Captain Ruckeen later signaled Admiral Philip Vian with characteristic British understatement, little redacted. Vian replied dryly, "Are you addressing me?" Minutes after Formidable was hit, 2 kamikazes targeted HMS Indomitable Admiral Vian's flagship. At 11:47 hours, a Zero climbed to 3,000 feet, then dove from the starboard beam at 60 degrees. Heavy anti-aircraft fire from Oerlikons and pom-poms set the aircraft ablaze. The pilot misjudged his height and belly flopped onto the armored flight deck, skidded across the ship, and bounced over the port side approximately 10 yards astern of the island. His bomb exploded in the water. Burning petrol temporarily engulfed the flight deck, but the kamikaze didn't penetrate the armor. 0 casualties aboard ship. The flight deck was operational again within hours. An American liaison officer aboard Indomitable witnessed both attacks. He suggested the carrier return to base for repairs. When told the ship would be operational shortly, he threw his hat on the bridge floor and stamped on it in disbelief. He exclaimed that American wooden deck carriers would have been finished. 8 minutes later, 11:55, a second kamikaze dove for Indomitable, but was shot down by the destroyer HMS Quilliam and the carrier S gunners, crashing into the sea 10 yards off the bow. HMS Indomitable had survived 3 kamikaze attacks in less than 10 minutes with 0 casualties. Ever seen someone survive something that should have killed them? May 9, 1945, the kamikazes launched coordinated strikes. HMS Victorious was hit by 2 kamikazes within minutes. At 16:56 hours, a Zero in a shallow dive approached from astern, carrying a 500-pound bomb with a small white parachute. Captain Michael Maynard Denny ordered a 25-degree turn to starboard. The aircraft's wheels touched the flight deck, the undercarriage sheared off, and the plane broke up, sliding 80 feet across the deck before crashing over the side. The impact created a 25-square-foot hole in the armor. The deck was depressed 3 inches over a 144-square-foot area. Aviation gasoline lines caught fire. 6 minutes later, a second kamikaze struck with a glancing blow after destroying 4 Corsairs. 4 men were killed and 19 wounded from both strikes combined. But Victorious remained operational. The carrier was launching planes within 1 hour and landing planes after 12 hours. Admiral Vian nicknamed the ship Trojan for missing only 1 minor operation since joining the Eastern Fleet in July 1944. At 17:07 hours, just 11 minutes after the Victorious attacks, a second kamikaze struck HMS Formidable aft. This was the carrier's second hit in 5 days. The impact depressed the flight deck 4.5 inches over a 10-foot square area. 6 Corsairs and 1 Avenger on deck were destroyed. 1 man was killed and 8 wounded. A red flag visual warning system introduced after the May 4th attack saved lives. Crew could take cover when kamikazes were inbound. The flight deck was operational again in 48 minutes. The contrast with American carrier experience was devastating, and the numbers would tell a story the Japanese never understood. USS Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945. The first kamikaze dropped a 550-pound bomb that penetrated the flight deck, then crashed onto the deck. The second crashed near the island superstructure. Parked aircraft full of fuel and ammunition on the flight deck ignited in massive fires. 346 were killed in action. 43 went missing. 264 were wounded. Total dead, 389. Bunker Hill maintained 20 knots despite fires throughout the ship. The carrier steamed to Ulithi, then Pearl Harbor, arriving at Bremerton Naval Shipyard for repairs. The ship was still under repair when the war ended in August 1945, though fully repaired by September. Bunker Hill never operated aircraft again. USS Enterprise, the most decorated United States carrier, met its combat end on May 14, 1945. A Zero piloted by Lieutenant Shunsuke Tomiyasu used cloud cover to approach, performed a snap roll to invert the aircraft, then dove through the forward flight deck. The explosion sent the 15-ton forward elevator rocketing 400 feet into the air. 14 men were killed and 68 wounded. Enterprise withdrew from combat on May 16 and never returned to war. Let's stop and look at the numbers, because the numbers tell a brutal story. British carriers hit by kamikazes suffered an average of 7 deaths and 25 wounded per impact across 4 carriers and 6 hits. Total British casualties, 28 killed and 101 wounded. American carriers with armed and fueled aircraft spotted on deck suffered 100 to 400 deaths per major kamikaze strike. Flight deck penetration rates differed dramatically. British 3-inch armor prevented penetration in 5 of 6 kamikaze hits. American wooden flight decks were penetrated in 80 to 90% of kamikaze hits, allowing bombs and burning aircraft to reach hangars where armed and fueled aircraft awaited. Repair time comparisons are equally dramatic. British carriers returned to flight operations in 30 minutes to 2 hours after kamikaze hits. American carriers required 2 to 6 months of shipyard repairs for major hits. What's the point of winning if you can't survive to fight again? Samuel Eliot Morison, the official United States naval historian present at Okinawa, provided the most famous observation after watching kamikazes hit both British and American carriers. A kamikaze hitting a steel flight deck crumpled up like a scrambled egg and did comparatively little damage. Morison documented American officers observing aboard British carriers who could hardly believe the differing results of kamikaze strikes. The United States Pacific Fleet report in May 1945 acknowledged the disparity without armored decks. Task Force 57 would have been out of action with 4 carriers for at least 2 months. This official assessment validated what observers had witnessed. British armored carriers returned to combat 50 to 100 times faster than American carriers after comparable hits. The difference in casualties per hit stemmed from 4 interrelated factors. First, penetration allowed bombs into vital spaces. American wooden flight decks offered no resistance to kamikaze impact or bomb penetration. Kamikazes routinely punched through 2 hangar decks where aviation, fuel, and ordnance were stored. British 3-inch armor detonated most bombs before they reached the hangar, containing damage above the armored box. Second, deck parks created massive secondary explosions. American carriers regularly spotted 30 to 50 armed and fueled aircraft on deck for rapid launch, maximizing offensive capability. When kamikazes hit these deck parks, secondary explosions from bombs, torpedoes, rockets, and ammunition cooking off in chain reactions killed hundreds. USS Franklin had 31 armed and fueled aircraft on deck when hit. The subsequent explosions killed more sailors than the initial bomb impacts. British carriers operated smaller air groups, 36 to 54 aircraft, compared to 80 to 110 American and-struck aircraft below into the protected hangar between sorties. Reducing exposure. Third, aviation fuel fires spread uncontrollably. American carriers carried vastly more aviation gasoline. Open hangar designs with roll-up doors allowed fires to spread rapidly through multiple decks. Wooden flight deck structures burned readily. British enclosed armored hangars confined fires within the citadel. The Royal Navy pioneered fuel system safety measures, storing aviation fuel in cylindrical tanks surrounded by seawater, purging fuel lines with carbon dioxide when not in use, and routinely draining fuel systems before expected combat. Fourth, timing amplified vulnerability. The most catastrophic American carrier damage occurred when carriers were preparing to launch strike stacks, packed with armed and fueled aircraft, ordnance being loaded, fuel systems pressurized. Franklin was arming aircraft for launch. Bunker Hill was preparing for operations. British operational tempo was lower, partly by necessity with smaller air groups, and partly by doctrine with more conservative aircraft handling reducing the frequency of maximum vulnerability moments. Admiral Raymond Spruance understood the difference. On April 8, 1945, after USS Hancock was severely damaged, Spruance specifically requested British Task Force 57 strike the dangerous Formosa airfields instead of American carriers. He believed the armored British carriers would be less vulnerable than United States carriers to kamikaze counterattack. This operational decision by the United States Fifth Fleet commander demonstrated that American leadership recognized British carrier resilience and actively exploited it. Actions speak louder than words. The highest-ranking American admiral in the Pacific chose to send British carriers on the most dangerous missions because he knew they could survive hits that would cripple American carriers. The post-war United States Navy would learn every lesson British carriers taught, and those lessons changed naval aviation forever. A-10 Joby Sisher, United States Naval Attach Report after examining HMS Formidable, stated, "Were I crossing the Pacific, I would prefer her to a Yorktown on the basis that she might carry fewer aircraft, but she would be much more likely to get there." The 1945 official United States Navy assessment concluded, "The damage experiences of several British carriers demonstrated the effectiveness of such armor." The effectiveness of armored flight decks against kamikaze attacks was demonstrated. The USS Midway class represented the American answer. Massive 59,910 carriers with 3.5-inch armored flight decks, plus additional armor at the hangar deck. Unlike British carriers, Midway class achieved both armor and capacity by going enormous 2.6 times larger than illustrious, embarking 137 aircraft despite armor. All subsequent United States attack carriers featured armored flight decks. More significantly, the United States Navy adopted 3 revolutionary British innovations that enabled the modern jet carrier. The angled flight deck invented by Captain D.R.F. Campbell, Royal Navy, in 1951, allowed aircraft missing arrestor wires to bolter around without hitting the deck park, enabling simultaneous launch and recovery operations. USS Antietam received the first experimental angled deck in 1952. USS Forrestal, commissioned 1955, was the first carrier designed with an angled deck. The steam catapult invented by Commander C.C. Mitchell, Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, working for Brown Brothers and Company, Edinburgh. 1946 to 1950 used ship steam instead of hydraulic systems. HMS Perseus demonstrated it to the United States Navy in December 1951 to February 1952. In April 1952, United States Navy decided to adopt the design and acquired manufacturing rights. USS Hancock received the first operational steam catapult in 1954. This innovation proved critical. Without steam catapults, the United States Navy could have launched heavy jet bombers like the A-3 Sky Warrior, carrying nuclear weapons, crippling carrier-based nuclear deterrent strategy. The mirror landing site invented by Commander Nicholas Goodhart. Royal Navy used a stabilized mirror to show pilots the correct glide path, later modified to use Fresnel lenses. Combined with the angled deck, this enabled safe jet operations. United States naval sources acknowledged the new carriers and rebuilt. Essex and Midway-class ships were viable in the face of modern land-based aircraft because of 2 innovations adopted from the British: the steam catapult and the angled deck. These 3 British innovations enabled operation of successive generations of increasingly heavy, high-performance jet aircraft through the Cold War and beyond. But the story has an ironic twist. British armored carriers appeared to survive better in combat, but suffered irreparable, cumulative structural damage that rendered them beyond economical repair post-war. The armored box hangar created a large void in the hull girder. Under shock from near misses and the cumulative stress of kamikaze impacts, the hull girder deformed irreversibly. Hulls became progressively twisted and rippled with damage. HMS Illustrious was scrapped in 1956, despite relatively light combat damage. HMS Formidable was scrapped in 1953. HMS Indomitable was scrapped in 1955. Only HMS Victorious was rebuilt 1950 to 1957 at costs exceeding £20 million. So expensive that planned rebuilds of Implacable and Indefatigable were cancelled. By contrast, Essex-class carriers with severe topside battle damage remained structurally sound and served for decades. USS Franklin, despite 807 deaths and catastrophic damage, was structurally intact and served until 1964 in reserve. USS Bunker Hill remained structurally sound and served until 1966. This represents an ironic reversal. British carriers survived combat hits better, but could all survive the peace. American carriers suffered worse combat damage, but remained viable for 20 to 30 more years of service. Comment: which design was actually better, British armor or American offense? The narrative requires contextualization. The British Pacific Fleet faced dramatically lower attack intensity than American forces. During the Okinawa campaign, United States Task Force 58, with 15 fast carriers, destroyed 1,980 Japanese aircraft. British Task Force 57, with 4 carriers, destroyed 75. The Japanese launched 10 Kaikasui massed kamikaze attacks against American forces. None were directed at British carriers. Americans faced approximately 25 times the attack intensity of the British. British carriers were hit at similar or slightly higher rates relative to their numbers 4 of 4 carriers hit, compared to 10 of 15 American carriers. But the absolute number of attacks was far lower. The British were never tested under sustained mass assault comparable to what American carriers endured. Neither design was unambiguously superior. Context determined effectiveness. British carriers proved tactically more resilient per hit. Armored decks prevented penetration. Damage control returned ships to operations within hours. Casualties per hit were dramatically lower. All 6 British armored carriers survived the war. But British carriers were strategically less capable. Small air groups limited offensive power and defensive combat air patrols. The hidden structural flaw from cumulative shock damage meant apparent combat survivors were actually beyond economical repair. Post-war, while American carriers with worse topside damage remained structurally sound and served for decades. The Americans faced 25 times more attacks but could absorb losses through superior numbers, industrial capacity, and logistics. The strongest evidence validating British superiority comes not from Japanese testimony, which doesn't exist in accessible sources, but from American operational decisions acknowledging British resilience and post-war adoption of British armored flight decks for all subsequent United States carriers. Admiral Spruance tasked British carriers with the most dangerous missions because he knew they could survive hits that would cripple American carriers. The United States Navy concluded armored flight decks were essential for carrier survivability, implementing them on Midway-class and all subsequent carriers. On Easter Sunday, 1945, American officers watched HMS Indefatigable take a kamikaze hit that would have crippled any American carrier. 37 minutes later, they watched that same carrier launch aircraft. They watched HMS Formidable take 2 kamikaze hits in 5 days and return to operations within hours each time. They watched HMS Victorious absorb 2 kamikazes in 6 minutes and continue fighting. They watched HMS Indomitable survive 3 kamikaze attacks in 10 minutes with 0 casualties. The American liaison officer who threw his hat on the bridge floor in disbelief captured what everyone witnessed. British armored carriers could survive punishment no American carrier could withstand. The divine wind that had crippled the United States Navy met 3 inches of British steel and crumpled like scrambled eggs. Admiral Henderson died in 1939, never knowing his armored carriers would save thousands of lives. But on May 9, 1945, when HMS Formidable took its second kamikaze hit and was operational again in 48 minutes. When British sailors swept burning wreckage overboard and returned to action while American carriers burned for days, Henderson's legacy proved itself in fire and steel. The Japanese never understood why British carriers wouldn't die. American observers could hardly believe it, even as they watched. But the numbers don't lie. 28 British dead across 6 kamikaze hits. Carriers operational in under 2 hours. Ships that refuse to sink, refuse to burn, refuse to quit. That is 3 inches of armored steel doing exactly what Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson designed it to do. Survive. Subscribe for more untold naval history.